So, notary. And Dr. Doa, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, I really wanted to start off by asking you. I think a lot of people in general, and particularly folks with multiple chemical sensitivity, have a lot of questions, and some are quite concerned, I believe, at this particular moment, 100 days into the Trump administration, the second, if regulations on chemicals that harm human health and the environment are going to change, or if they will become more relaxed, if corporations will have greater sway in terms of what they can produce and put on the shelves, etc. Any thoughts on that to get us going, please?
Yes, I think one of the concerns is, of course, the weakening of the regulations and approaches to dealing with chemicals. We had been making progress by starting to look at the mixture of chemicals we're exposed to rather than only looking at things chemical by chemical as if we were exposed in isolation to each of these things by itself. And when you consider the mixtures, and you could make more protective decisions when you regulate the risk of these chemicals, that I think now that we're 100 days in, I think we're going to go backwards, and we're starting to see that, number one. And I think the other thing that I'm concerned about going forward is that the chemical manufacturers will have more power and will push to have EPA approve chemicals that are toxic. And they want to make these chemicals seem fine so the consumer facing brands will use them.
Mm-hmm.
So, a particular concern of mine are sensitizers. EPA has generally not approved sensitizers, and the industry has really pushed back on this.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what sensitizers are and what kind of products they often show up in, please?
So, a sensitizer, one that jumps out is like diisocyanates, which are often used in spray foam. And so
Mm-hmm.
you may be exposed to a set level, and then you become sensitized. So even smaller
Mm-hmm.
amounts generate the same reactions. And these sensitizers can be used in consumer products.
And that language really makes sense to folks like us. We think about the tilt theory, toxicant-induced loss of tolerance, developed by Dr. Claudia Miller and colleagues, where the theory is we can become sensitized to products, chemical products, from one large exposure or many smaller exposures. So that seems to be what you're talking about.
Oh, exactly. Exactly. This has been documented, like with isocyanates in workers' spray
Mhm.
application of this. We have all this data showing the adverse effects.
Yeah. Dr. Doa, throughout your career, you've been focused on chemicals for decades. How often does multiple chemical sensitivity, idiopathic environmental illness, toxicant-induced loss of tolerance, chemical intolerance come up for you? How much of it is on your radar?
It's on my radar primarily with things like the sensitizers, as I mentioned, also some of the chlorinated solvents that folks are exposed to, used in dry cleaning, because they often cause the same effects. Looking at what's called cumulative risk, and that's dealing with the types of chemicals that cause the same effects when you look at the loading of them together.
That's really interesting to hear you talk about the combination, because I often talk with researchers who focus on chemicals and they often say similar things. It's the combination that we don't really know what that risk is, what risks that poses. Is that essentially what you're saying?
It's important. It's real life. The forever chemicals, PFAS, I think most people know what those are. And we're exposed to often to mixtures.
Mm.
They're everywhere. in our environment. I think it's a scientifically much stronger way
Mm,
of looking
mm,
at things rather
mhm.
than looking at things totally in isolation.
Yeah, and that's our reality, right? Like when I think of my young children going off to school, on the drive to school or the walk to school, they're being exposed to petrochemicals, maybe people's laundry coming out of their dryer vents. At school, the air fresheners, the laundry products on people's bodies, and more, right? In the furniture.
Exactly. In schools, just have a mixture of different things. The fragrances in cleaning supplies. For me, that's a big thing.
Yeah.
There are also things like the lead that's in older schools
Mhm.
or PCBs and
I'd like to share a brief quote from a scholarly paper published in 2023 in the Journal of Public Health by Anita Desikan and colleagues.
mhm.
And it's about the Trump administration and chemical regulation. These attacks on science, such as buried research, censored scientists, halted data collection, increased in number to unprecedented levels. Underserved communities bore the brunt of the harms. Such attacks disproportionately harm Black, Indigenous, low income communities and communities of color, all of whom have long been burdened by pollution, exposure, and other stressors.
Yeah, totally agree. Because, a lot of these communities, frontline communities, they're exposed to a greater number of chemicals than the
Mhm,
general population and often at higher levels than the general population. Clearly, they have anything that this administration thinks is DEI or tangentially
mhm,
related, they're pulling back on. And so they really are trying to cut back any research, putting money into research, looking at the exposures faced by these communities that
mhm,
are already overloaded by
mhm.
chemical exposures.
Yeah.
And it was something that we saw in Trump 1. I was at EPA in Trump 1, and there was a lot where the big push was to downplay the toxicity of chemicals so that you didn't have to regulate them, or if you were going
Mhm.
to regulate them at a much lower level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was I meant to invite you to introduce yourself a little bit more. Of course, I will have read your bio, but that's a really interesting fact that you mentioned that you were working in the Environmental Protection Agency under the Trump administration. Do you want to talk a little bit about what I could imagine must have been regular pressures? What are your priorities and what kind of pressures were you meeting when it comes to chemical regulation?
So you were correct. There was a lot of pressure under Trump 1. I was in the chemicals office, and there was pressure to change assessments so that the chemicals looked less toxic, to weaken the regulations on the chemicals. And this was incessant the whole time. And I was there in the toxics office the first 2 years trying to change the science was and how EPA did the science was another thing. I mean, I pushed back a
Hmm.
lot, that pushback and pushback on this. And I can't tell you how many times I said when they wanted to do something that's not factually correct, we can't do that. It's not correct. Yeah.
Were you ever threatened with your job?
I wasn't threatened to be fired. It became untenable, and eventually I left the Office of Research and Development for the last 2 years
Hmm.
of the first Trump administration, and there was a lot of pressure on EPA in that office to
Hmm.
change how the science was being done and the
Hmm.
tools that were being used to conduct the science so that the
Hmm.
chemicals again looked less toxic, less risky.
Do you hear from any colleagues these days who are working under Trump administration too?
I do,
Hmm.
and I think people are reeling, a number of folks are reeling to deal with the changes that
Hmm.
are going on.
And are there any particular types of chemicals that stand out or products? Are we talking about pesticides that people put on their lawns? Or are we talking about health beauty products or everything?
I think there's a lot of pressure on chemicals that could be used in consumer
Mm-hmm.
products, but it's not from the consumer companies. It's more from the chemical manufacturers because they want the consumer facing brands to be able to use them.
If we were to talk about particular products, like we go shopping, are there any particular products that we should be particularly aware of? Are we talking about dishwasher soap or laundry soap or shampoo, mosquito spray? There's any things, tangible products that come to mind?
Yeah, like I look at cleaning supplies and
Mm-hmm.
I try to make sure that they're safer choice. I tend to stay away from things that have fragrances in them. I'm pretty conscious about cosmetics.
Yeah. And I think listeners, folks with multiple chemical sensitivity, are pretty well versed in safer choices. But it's scary if you think about it that the general population is being exposed to potentially a lot more hazardous levels of products, chemicals.
Oh, I agree. And even like at plastics, I'm trying to be very careful to stay away from, well, I
Mm-hmm.
tend to use glass and other things like that. But
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
plastics, particularly like PVC, has phthalates in it. And, exposure to phthalates causes developmental effects on the reproductive system, as well as a whole range of other things.
Mm-hmm.
You'd be surprised at all the stuff that's in plastics that can
Yeah.
come out of plastics.
It's really hard as a consumer. I face that choice regularly. Am I going to buy the peanut butter organic unsalted? It
Yeah.
doesn't, that's all, in a plastic jar and it's a few dollars less. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, is this particular plastic jar going to cause harm to my family? And I don't know the answer to that.
If there's a choice, I will try to, like use glass containers. And I know this for everyone because it
No,
adds weight and there are other
of course.
considerations if you have kids and they drop it. So I understand. But yeah,
Hmm.
it's just something that we deal with because the potential for exposure is
Yeah,
everywhere.
everywhere, isn't it? In the air, in the water, in the food we eat. Please let me ask you about fragrance because this is really top of mind for a lot of people with multiple chemical sensitivity. What are your, let me just ask you generally, what are your thoughts on fragrance and the chemical composition and the harms?
So I think some fragrances are sensitizers. And so you can have like
Mm,
health skin sensitizers, and they're often, particularly in detergents and things, they can be toxic to environmental organisms. If I'm going to use a fragrance like in a cologne or something, I'm going to be very targeted to that. And just because I don't know which of the fragrances in a lot of materials will be sensitizers.
mhm. My understanding is corporations, companies aren't required to say what is in fragrance.
Well, I know they're not required like for a lot of the cleaning supplies,
Mhm.
unless for like safer choice, and then they'll get the information on that.
You mentioned a safer choice. Another website or an app that people use and recommend is the Environmental Working Group. Is
Hmm.
that something you recommend for folks when they're looking at products and to determine if they're safe or not?
Yeah, I think that's very helpful.
Yeah. Fragrance products for me, like my kryptonite is laundry products. And that goes for a lot of people,
Right.
whether it's the fabric softeners or dryer sheets. I'm just currently dealing with like a 48-hour reaction from dryer sheets
Oh,
because they really flood a neighborhood. They contaminate a whole block. They can. And I'm exposed to them regularly, as are a lot of people, and laundry products of all kinds. They seem to be becoming increasingly scented, or the scents are increasingly potent. They're made to last longer. Do you have any thoughts on the fragrances and the toxicity in laundry products?
not beyond like there are beyond the sensitization and the eco tox. But I agree, like the dryer sheets, you can tell when somebody's drying their clothes.
Yeah. And what I often think, like on a personal level, why would someone do that to be so unaware of the impact on the environment and other humans and themselves? Why would they do that? But then I think we often, people with MCS ask, how can this be? How can these actually be sold and marketed and mass produced and bought and used? So that's a regulation question, right?
And I wonder if it's also giving feedback to
Hmm.
the companies. They have a lot of products with fragrance, although they also have products without fragrance, but it's pushing back on the companies, making sure they're using safer chemicals,
Hmm.
I think is really important also.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the areas I was really glad to hear you talk about, because I came across a list that someone posted online about important things that companies can do. And one of them is to empower consumers, first of all, by being more transparent with labels and ingredients and the potential health risks, and then allowing mechanisms for feedback. Like if I think about laundry products, it requires a lot of energy for people who have chronic illness, in our case, to find out, how do I get in touch with these people? And am I going to be heard? What are the mechanisms? And that doesn't seem to be very transparent at the moment.
I agree. And I looked at one of the consumer companies earlier today. They have a section on sustainability, but they don't
Hmm.
have a section on like green chemistry or
Hmm.
safe chemicals. And I think the other thing with the companies that, we often talk about safer chemicals, but I really think
Hmm.
these companies should be using safe chemicals, things
Hmm.
that are not going to cause harms. And it's a
Hmm.
paradigm shift trying to encourage and develop ways to have safe chemicals versus safer.
Yeah, that's very encouraging. The list I mentioned, one of them is to develop fragrance-free products. And we
Yes.
see that sometimes. I can think of a laundry product where they have the scented version and a fragrance-free version. And I know there's differences between unscented and fragrance-free. Yeah, there's nuances there, but sometimes it's an illusion too, right?
Right.
Like these safer products, they're not always that safe, correct?
Right. And then sometimes scents are added to cover up the smell of another chemical so that they're not adding like something to smell like lilac, but they are adding something to cover up maybe a kind of a chemical smell from something else. The other thing I wanted to mention about, and states are taking
Yeah.
action on this, are things that are added to detergents
Hmm.
that are endocrine disruptors.
Hmm.
So affect us, affect, plants, animals. Those are more subtle things affect health.
Yes, yes. I'm glad you mentioned that. And then so we have the states, some are taking action and hopefully more will. And in Canada and other countries, local governments, provincial governments, hopefully they will call for action and do more. But when it comes to the individual, we talked about providing feedback to companies. A listener of this podcast asks, how can we plan to help ourselves in the face of regulations going out the window? Who are the allies in government, nonprofits, universities, labs that MCS community can work with?
Well, and I think Washington State and California are leaders in this area. And I think it's important, it's a little bureaucratic, but if the states are out front before the federal government takes action, the states can have a more protective law than if the federal government takes action first. What's called preempts the states.
Mhm.
So I think being vocal at the state level is really important.
Yeah, and like I just saw someone did a study about MCS in India, and they report that over half the population in India has MCS. It's
Wow.
not surprising, and I wonder if US relaxing their regulations on chemicals could have a global impact.
There are two parts. One
Hmm.
is things made in the US or allowed in the US can have a global impact if the supply chains are global. The second, where it could have a global impact, if the chemicals that are being used in the US are bioaccumulative and toxic, and they can undergo long range transport. I mean, but there are a
Hmm.
number of pesticides that have turned up in the Arctic. I think
Yes.
those are the two areas that are extremely important.
Yes. And on that note, I've come across studies that show that fragrances are showing up in the Antarctic as well. When we talk about supply chains, I often think of what's happening in Japan, and I'm hoping to have a guest on, a researcher from Japan, who can talk about the growing level of MCS in Japan. It's because multinational corporations are increasingly selling highly fragranced laundry products there, and thousands of people are developing MCS, becoming sensitized. And that wasn't an issue before.
Wow.
It's really
Wow.
sad. Yeah, it's really sad.
It is. And I think another area, because I accidentally bought this, I
Mm.
usually buy unscented laundry detergent from a green supplier, and I accidentally bought one with fragrance. That's another area to, yeah, I understand choice, but I'm just,
What are you wondering?
do our laundry detergents need all these smells? I just
Hmm.
don't.
Yeah. And you mentioned choice, right? And we talked about the burden that falls on the consumer. And I often feel like it's an oppression. We're being oppressed because we're forced to do this labor. And often it falls on women in households to do it, right? It's really complicated reading labels in the first place. So we have to become lay chemists just to keep our families and selves safe.
Goes back to an earlier question you asked me
Mm.
about regulation of fragrances. But I think
Mhm.
to do that, the way the regulations work is you need to be able to quantify the benefits of, let's say, not allowing fragrances in detergents, and which
Mhm.
is not a trivial thing because you would have to not only identify the harms, from
Mhm.
exposure to these multiple chemicals, but monetize the benefits of prohibiting it. And I think that just makes it more complicated.
Yeah. And that's interesting. There is a huge growing market who wants these really genuinely safe, unscented, fragrance free products. Well, I'd like to, as we aim towards wrapping up, I'd like to ask you a couple specifics questions from listeners. What is being done to regulate, limit, eliminate the use of chemicals in schools, public medical facilities, and senior care and nursing homes?
So there are some laws that apply, like to lead and asbestos
Mhm.
in schools. But a lot that's being done is, at the federal level for schools.
Mhm.
And again, focusing on cleaning supplies and addressing vapor intrusion, chemicals that may be in groundwater that come up through buildings, through homes and schools. The regulations are limited on everything that's being used in schools.
And hospitals, it's people really have challenges with fragrances in hospitals.
Yeah, it's mostly trying to get the folks who run these things to manage it differently in terms of the cleaning agents that they're bringing in or how they're doing their renovations in the schools and dealing with things like mercury and lead and asbestos.
And the cleaning products that you mentioned and the air fresheners. And a lot of us are aging, and a lot of people have questions about what can I do as I age and I can't be in my own home. Is it possible to find a residential place, for lack of a better word, that's going to be safe for me? And because of lax regulations, it can be tough.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and you have to be very diligent, I think, just to make sure they're not using all these chemicals.
It falls on the managers, the companies. The regulation is not there to protect us.
Yes, going back to what's happening now, they cut all this research money away, and
Hmm.
there were grants that were looking at dealing with chemicals more, and it's just going to set everything back more, and people are going to suffer.
Yeah. That's a really depressing way to end, but it's honest. We have to talk the truth, right?
Right.
Yeah. So, anything
Yes,
else
sir.
you'd like to share, Dr. Doa?
No, just thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much for taking time.